people like Sam Harris and Richard Dawkins, they assume that the natural person is the civilized creature that you see before you in a discussion like this. But I don't believe that. I think that people are far crazier and far more destructive and far greater as well than the typical rationalist approach. Rationality is a surface facade. That's all. And the idea that people will eventually be rational, it's much more likely that they will be irrational than rational. And you could say, for example, that Catholicism, let's say, for all its irrationality, was as rational as people can get. If you remove that level of irrationality, that's structural, say, then everything falls apart and people get so irrational you can't believe it. Not more rational. You know, because they, like Harrison and his crowd, think that we were superstitious for thousands of years. Kind of savage and superstitious. And then all of a sudden the Enlightenment came along in the scientific revolution, and poof, we got rational. And since then things have been good. And that's not how it looks to me at all. I don't buy that. I think that our rationality, as I said already, our rationality, even our science, is nested inside this larger metaphysical structure. This is also something that Carl Jung would be an advocate of. That there's an irrational, pragmatic, I would say evolutionarily determined ethic underneath this rationality. And when it goes, then all that rationality goes too. So yes, you can be a non-believer, but the funny thing about that is too, you can't be a non-believer in your action, you see, because Harris's metaphysics is fundamentally Christian. So he acts out a Christian metaphysics, but he says, well, I don't believe it. It's like, well, yeah, you do, because you're acting it out. You just say you don't believe it, but you believe it.
What do you mean he's acting it out? Like what, for example?
Well, he doesn't rob banks, doesn't kill people, doesn't rape, doesn't murder, you know.
Want to do with you here. So let's say Earth is crumbling. We have two ships. We're going to send the people that believe what you're saying here, basically, that we need this sort of religious underpinning. And then the Dawkins, Sam people, they're going to take their 100 people, you're going to take your 100 people. We're going to go to two different planets and set things up the way they should be. You know, blank slate for each. I guess the part that I would struggle with here is to understand how their ship lands, they're rooted in science and in basic liberalism and acceptance of others and all that, how that society would not flourish from the base level if we could just reset. Now, I think you could make a great argument that we can't do it here because there's just so much history here and all that stuff. But if we were just resetting on another place, why could we not do it that way and have it work?
Well,
Part that I would struggle with here is to understand how their ship lands, they're rooted in science and in basic liberalism and acceptance of others and all that, how that society would not flourish from the base level if we could just reset. Now, I think you could make a great argument that we can't do it here because there's just so much history here and all that stuff. But if we were just resetting on another place, why could we not do it that way and have it work?
Well, first of all, you know, there's an assumption that science and the scientific worldview in some sense has won. You know, and because it's so self-evident, let's say, because of what it can produce, that people just will accept it and move forward with it. But I'm not sure about that either. I mean, I think there's a strong anti-science movement afloat now. I don't think there's any reason to assume that a scientific attitude of that sort would be stable. I mean, it's only 300 years old, 400. I mean, people don't like it when I say that because, okay, fine, you can chase it back to some degree to the ancient Greeks, you know, barely.
Right.
But really, it was Newton and Bacon and Descartes, and that's not very long ago. And we take it for granted, but there's anti-science movements popping up. Well, look, the whole debate over biology to some degree is profoundly an anti-science movement, and not unconsciously so, consciously so.
Yeah,
right?
very consciously.
Yes, very
so,
consciously
so. Yeah.
So I don't think that there's any reason to assume something like that would be stable. There's no evidence that it's stable, let's say, whereas there is evidence for the stability of cultures that were non-scientific for thousands of years, millions of years for that matter, at least hundreds of thousands of years.
Yeah.
So this claim that all hierarchies are based on power. But Frans de Waal, who's a Dutch anthropologist who studied chimps for a long time, has noted that the brutal chimp dictatorship tends to be unstable and end in a very violent, mean manner. Well, so if you're a brutal chimp leader and you're always tormenting everyone and you don't do any reciprocal grooming and you don't have any friends, then one day two chimps who are nicely bonded together, 3/4 your size, wait and ambush you and tear you into pieces.
Yeah.
And so one of the things de Waal has noted is that the stable chimpanzee troops tend to have a leader that's quite pro-social. A lot of friends, a lot of social bonds, a lot of mutual grooming. And so you could see even there, imagine that there are sets of hierarchies among chimpanzees, and there's different principles of leadership at the top. Then you could imagine a competition across time. Which principle of leadership is going to produce the most stable and functional chimpanzee hierarchy? Well, that is exactly what does happen. And so there's some shape that the top of the hierarchy starts to take, and you could think about that as the beginnings of an ideal, right? And then it's even more complicated than that, because let's say you get a stable hierarchy set up, and then this is what happens in human beings. It doesn't happen in chimps, or it does, but only to a limited degree. You get a stable hierarchy set up, and then there's some pattern of behavior that emerges that reliably moves men to the top of that. Okay, they leave more offspring. So what happens is that the male dominance hierarchy, the male hierarchy, forget about dominance, the male hierarchy becomes a selection mechanism. It promotes men to the upper ranks, and then the women peel off the top, because we know that human females do that. Chimpanzee females don't. They're promiscuous maters. The dominant males are more likely to mate with the females, but that's because they chase the subordinates away. It's not because the females are choosy. So the reason I'm telling you this, it's really important, because imagine that there's a reliable pattern of behavior that will move you up a male hierarchy across time. Well, what that means is that men over time have become biologically adapted to that pattern. The hierarchy is there, it's stable, it exists across millions of years. And so it acts as a selection mechanism by promoting men. And so the men who have the genes that are most likely to get them promoted put those genes forward. And so we get more like the group ideal as we progress through time, both biologically and culturally. And then we also start to articulate that group ideal. And that's partly what a religion does when it's coming up with the idea of an ideal.
He has cited examples. He didn't go all up into details in it on this comedy special, but if you follow his interviews from Oprah all the way over the last 20, you know exactly who he's talking about and what he's talking about. And he called it out and created the room for some very necessary discussions about who are the gatekeepers of a culture that is castrating black straight men.
Yeah.
And people are going to wake up and be like, well, damn, it's not the white conservative religious man that's doing this. It's actually somebody else.
Oh yeah. I think that's true. And I think for too long, and I mean, in our community, almost every conversation ends up going back to slavery and segregation, right? The problem is we were emancipated, we gained our freedom, but somewhere along the way, someone decided to put a for sale sign back on black folk. And it was oftentimes our leaders who did it. And our price is way too low. So when they sell us superficial representation, we say, here's our vote. When they sell us toxic culture, if it and this was back in the late 80s, so being, having black men at the forefront of it, was popular then. It's sure, we'll buy it. We'll buy it, we'll pump it, we'll repeat it, we will make it, infuse it into mainstream black culture. It doesn't matter, whether we call each other B's and N-words and show videos of us, disrespecting women and pulling their tops down and showering them with champagne and shooting at, other black men. It's an opportunity for some black men to make some money, so we'll buy it. And we're seeing the next iteration of that right now, where we are making it much, much harder to raise children in this culture. And recently my wife asked me, like, so why do you think that you feel so much stronger about these things? And I told her, once we had kids, the stakes got raised, because at some point I'm leaving this earth. I hope it's a long time from now, but I'm going to leave something back for my children and my children's children and my children's children's children, Lord willing. And the way things are going now, I don't know what that's going to look like. And part of the problem, and I put this squarely on the black leadership class, is that ours is the only community that spends as much time talking about the society that our ancestors had to endure rather than the society that our descendants will inhabit, right? We are leaving something to our kids. And if you look around and you listen to, the black elected officials, right? The Cori Bushes, the Ayanna Presleys, the people who argue that more abortions are good for the black community, that sex work is good for the black community, right? That men can get pregnant. These are the people that we elect to office. When you look at our cultural leaders, people like LeBron James, who pushes hysteria and delusion and neuroses. Oh, we're hunted every day. Really? How, LeBron? You mean by black men killing each other in big cities? No, by renegade cops. Okay, that's what he pushes. And at our schools and our universities, in some of these big cities, it's like less than 30% of the black students are reading or doing math at grade level. And what's the response from the black educators? Social justice education, anti-racism, equity. So you're turning out kids who can't read the protest signs that they're writing. And that is what we're leaving our children. So of course, other people are going to say, look, these black folk, this is an easy market. We will sell them whatever. If we put a black face on it, they'll buy it. And in life, what people sell you says something about them. But what you buy says something about you. And I think what Dave is exposing is not just the outside forces that are pushing on the black community, but he's exposing the internal forces which have allowed those outside forces to penetrate our city walls and to take up shop in our communities.